Ready?
Mhm.
So first, just kind of say your name and where you work.
My name is Fernandez. I'm an anchor in Detroit, Michigan. I've been in the business for about 24 years.
Why did you decide to become a journalist?
I was always passionate about the news. You know, growing up back in the late 70s and early 80s, our families made life around the news. The news was always an important part of our day to day. I know when my grandmother was watching me, I'd always have to watch the 12 o'clock news before she watched The Young and the Restless. So that was part of our lunch routine. And then in the evenings, we ate dinner around the news. And that was my family's way of keeping up on what was going on in the community. And it was my way, indirectly, of knowing what was happening. What was happening in our community, too.
So, being a black male, a journalist, what differences do you see in what you do and what your white male counterparts or white counterparts do?
You know, it's interesting. When I started working in news, didn't see too many people who looked like me in the newsrooms. And mentors had always told me that there was a different sense of responsibility as a journalist and as a minority in the newsroom. So I was always conditioned to think that I had to work harder and that the expectations would be greater. So among the main differences would be the types of stories that I was urged to cover or the types of story assignments that I would cover were quite different. I know I made it a point to try to be very representative of the communities that I covered or lived in. And so it was tough sometimes making sure that we had equal representation of coverage in our community, because you definitely know that there's some portions of the community that don't get covered equally. I always thought it was my mission to make sure I presented those stories in our editorial process and fight to get them told. But sometimes when you're in a newsroom that isn't very diverse, sometimes they don't understand, your colleagues don't understand the importance of why some stories need to be told. So you have to fight that extra harder. And then there are also opportunities where you definitely have to be conscious of how you may be perceived in newsrooms, because your passion may be confused for aggression, which is not the case all the time. So those are some of the nuances that I've learned to navigate in newsrooms, and how you definitely get the impression that there's a different type of reality when it comes to you and some of your colleagues who don't look like you.
Credibility. Do you feel that people think you're credible?
I definitely know that people think I'm credible because I work to gain their trust. And for me, it's all about integrity and ethics. So I'm a genuine kind of guy. And when I contact my sources, or when I'm navigating to make sources, the main thing that I want them to know is that I'm authentic and that they can trust me. So for me, credibility hasn't been a big thing, because it hasn't been a big issue to tackle, because I'm just genuine when I go up. I want people to be comfortable talking to me and feel like they can trust me. So I always approach people, community members, professionals, and my colleagues like that.
Do you think people question your credibility because you're a black man?
You know, it's interesting. I think that some people, our viewers or community members, may question without knowing you or knowing your work, just because of the way you look. It's been interesting because in certain markets that I've worked, especially when you go into some neighborhoods, you definitely feel uncomfortable because of the stereotypes of those communities, or how you're perceived in some of the communities. So it's like, as a beat reporter, sometimes it's not uncommon that you have to go and knock on someone's door. And in different markets where people look like me, if I have to go into a community that doesn't really look like me, I get a little hesitant sometimes. Back then, I would definitely have my photographer come out the car with me and make sure they have their camera, so that folks would know that I'm non-threatening when I approach them. I hate to use that term, but we're living in the world that we live in. And I worked a lot of my career in Michigan and in Texas, and there were certain communities where the diversity was lacking. And so that was definitely conscious that how I was perceived among community members. But I think, it's easy to say the work that we do speaks for itself. not always the case when we're dealing with real humans and real emotions and real perceptions of who we may be.
Has there ever been a situation where you felt threatened or felt uncomfortable because you're a black male journalist? And that's a two-part question. And do you think your non-black colleagues feel the same doing their jobs?
You know, it's interesting. One of the most interesting One of the most interesting challenges that I've had to face in my career was when I worked in Houston. We covered a lot of crime there, and it wasn't uncommon for us to go and do door knocks. And I was assigned a story about a super aggravated sexual assault of a child. There was a 73-year-old man. You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, I'll start that over. So one of the most interesting experiences that I've had where I think race and the fact that I was a journalist came into play was when I was working in Houston. I was assigned a story about a case of super aggravated sexual assault of a child. A 73-year-old man was accused of having an inappropriate situation with his 5-year-old neighbor. We did the door knock, had to go and be fair and ask him questions. Well, as soon as I get to the house, knock on the door, he comes to the door, shirts off, he's holding a bologna sandwich. I asked, hello, are you such and such? He told me, yeah. He saw my photographer out in the driveway. He immediately turns around, grabs a pistol from his china cabinet and points it in my face and tells me to get off his property. I was so nervous, and I think in that situation, it felt like a racialized moment, just because of what I looked like and what this guy looked like. One of the things that I found out after the fact, we definitely called the police, but they sent me to this guy's house, not telling me that his son was already convicted of murder after chopping a woman's body up and putting it in a case and leaving it in a wooded area. So you kind of understand the dynamics. And this is one of the interesting thing. This was a place called Cut and Shoot, Texas. That's the city, literally, Cut and Shoot, Texas, way out in a remote area. So, I don't think that our colleagues definitely play or think about personal safety when you're going into situations like that. But in that moment, it was definitely something that I felt like was a racialized moment because of what the guy told me and the force with which he told us to leave his place, and the steps he took to put a gun in my face when just asking questions about, trying to be fair about this story, this arrest and the charges against him. So, that was one situation, but it always had been a concern of mine going to different neighborhoods about my personal safety and how we perceived. So it was not uncommon for me to ask photographers to step out of the car with me while I go and knock on the door, just because for me it was a different level of safety, knowing even if it was a non-black photographer, that at least they would see someone who they could identify with, and they had a camera, so they knew that we were the news and perhaps not going to be a threat to them or their personal safety at the time.
How did your colleagues respond to that, your white colleagues?
Shock, initially, and curiosity, because they want to know why is my lived experience and the way I think about approaching work so different. It's interesting because I think I may have shared with you, Rod, working in a newsroom that isn't the most diverse, one of the things that I'm very focused. And when I'm at my desk, I'm focused on my story, getting things done. And I think I'm a pretty approachable guy. And I've always had mentors who told me you don't want to be perceived as argumentative or the angry black man in a newsroom or a work situation. And I've never had that experience because that's just not the energy that I bring to work. But it's so interesting. One time I had to point out to a supervisor when she asked me, is everything okay? You just look upset, you look angry. I was like, far from, I'm having a good day. And then it dawned on me, when certain colleagues who did not look like me asked me certain questions about my demeanor or my facial expressions when I'm just having a regular day, it was interesting that they equated my silence or my hard work to being unagreeable or giving the perception that I was in a mood because I was focused on doing my work. And when I ask them about it, it's almost like you get a pause because they believe you're calling them racist, and that's not the case. When I'm like, okay, so what is it about me that has you calling me these buzzwords that equate to black men being argumentative, angry, upset, or problematic in the workplace when that's really not the energy that I bring to a space, you know? So navigating those types of situations in different newsrooms has always been very interesting to me.
Is it odd to you that you have to be innately aware of these tropes and these stereotypes that exist when really you're just trying to go tell stories?
It is odd because it makes you think, okay, I know my lived experiences and I know the advice that my mentors, my family have given me, and I just know the way that I move and navigate. But it also makes you wonder about your colleagues and other people who have different lived experiences, and what is it about their lived experiences that translate certain things that just may not be accurate or true about how you live and operate. So it's kind of like interesting.
Anything else you want to add that I didn't ask?
You know, I'll tell you this. For me, and how I got into journalism, I didn't take the traditional route, and I didn't go to a journalism school. I often tell some of the students that I mentor about my experience getting into the business. I always wanted to be a journalist, a storyteller. I started off doing radio on a kids program at a gospel station. That was my first bite into the news business and telling stories, sharing stories. And it was so unique because I'm from Baltimore, so we were doing stories that were interesting to children at the time in the city of Baltimore. And I always had this curiosity about journalism, but you know how it is when your family, they push you to go a different way. And I was being a little rogue or renegade in my own way and trying to find non-traditional approaches to the newsroom. It's interesting because I took a year off between undergrad and law school, and I went to the state fair in Maryland. And there, one of the TV stations that I loved, WJZ, you know, I mentioned that growing up, we were always watching the news. There was one African-American anchor on the newscast. His name was Al Sanders. And he was the model of journalism for me. He was someone who I could identify with. He looked like us, and he was telling stories about our community and neighborhood. So that was probably the motivator that piqued my curiosity about what news actually is. So WJZ was at the Timonium Fair grounds for the state fair, and I was like, oh, there's WJZ. I went up and I expressed my interest to one of their staffers about my interest in the business. And because my degrees weren't in journalism, and she told me, you're not going to be able to make it. You don't have the journalism. But she didn't know my story. Even though I didn't major in journalism, I did major in theater, African American studies, and I have I have a minor in political science. So I have the English, I have the curiosity and the research behind me. And it was that moment where being told no by someone who you watch every day and who you may look up to, it made me think, I'm not going to let this person tell me no. And I was so driven to, it was a motivator actually, to get into the business and find ways, non-traditional ways, to get into the business and be successful. And I think I can't be mad at the woman because I made it. I made it possible for me, and I appreciate so many of the people who told me no or gave me opportunities to thrive, because now I feel like I'm not only surviving as a journalist, a black male journalist, I'm also thriving and telling the stories that I was so passionate about wanting to cover, and telling the stories about the communities that I like to cover. And also bring a different type of essence to the newsrooms that I've been privileged and blessed to work, because you know, I definitely think that we need diversity in newsrooms, diversity of thought, diversity of experiences. And one of the things that I do almost every day is enterprise stories. When I move to an area or when I go out and about, I'm that curious kind of guy that I get lost in communities, and I naturally talk to folks, and I've been pretty lucky and blessed in that through conversations, non-traditional conversations, that I find the story or uniqueness in our communication, and I can morph that into a story that can appeal to so many people. So I've been blessed to have those opportunities, and I count it all back to being told no, you wouldn't be successful because you didn't take a traditional route. I made it work, and these days I tell so many young students about that story and about how it's easy for folks to kill your dream. But sometimes those buzzkills can be just the motivation you need to keep on going and break open some doors and knock down some barriers.